Have you ever had such a prophetic dream that you had to answer its call? I have, and it changed my life. It was 2003, and I was in Kathmandu, Nepal. I was there as a volunteer primary school teacher. I was on sabbatical from my corporate job in London. I was burnt out, exhausted, and I was searching for new meaning in life. The first week in the classrooms, I noticed that when I walked into the boys' classroom, there were all these missiles flying through the air, paper airplanes, a lot of laughter, and a lot of fun. I used to love going into those classrooms. And then when I walked into the girls' classrooms, they were sitting quietly with serious expressions on their face. And it got me wondering, why is it these little girls are not playing and having fun like the boys? One day, I was walking back from school, and I stopped by the side of the road. I saw a little baby girl playing there. I was frantically looking around for her caregivers because there were cars and lorries and motorbikes and rickshaws flying by. And this man looked over at me and he shouted, "I sell her to you for 1,000 rupees. I was horrified. Is he joking or is he serious? I looked back at the little girl. She was wearing a yellow dress, the color of primroses, and it was covered in dust. Feeling foolish and a bit embarrassed in a different culture, not really knowing my way around, I decided to keep walking. I've never forgotten about that little girl, nor stopped wondering what happened to her. In fact, something about that moment really got me thinking about gender and gender inequities. And as I went on during my time in Nepal, I discovered that girls were being trafficked from Nepal to India. Many of them were told they were going to be working as domestics, but they ended up forced into brothels and repeatedly raped. I was appalled and horrified at the fact that this was happening and so little was being done about it. I start reflecting on my own childhood growing up in Ireland. In the 70s when I was a little girl, and then in the 80s as a young woman. Ireland at that time was a very conservative Catholic society. It was a place where we had Magdalene laundries. These are state and church-run institutions. And women who were pregnant and were not married were often placed into these institutions out of sight, so as not to shame or embarrass their families or their communities. It was a time in Ireland when there was little or no access to contraception, particularly if you weren't married. There was no access to abortion, and there was no access to divorce. And so I start talking about my childhood and thinking about it more. And one day, one of the other volunteers, Jess, a wonderful Canadian woman, utterly sensible, she encouraged me to go with her to the town of Pokhara in the foothills of the Himalayas. It just sounded so romantic and so beautiful. I wanted to go there. So off we went, and in the middle of Pokhara, there's this beautiful lake, Lake Fua. So we hired a boat and we rowed out into the center of the lake. It was a beautiful, calm day with a bright blue sky. We were so happy. And I was saying to Jess, I'm going to have to go back to my corporate life in London soon, but I really don't want to. It's making me miserable, but I don't know what I want to do instead. And she said to me, Shirley, come on, it's obvious what you're going to do. And I was like, really? What? And she goes, all you ever talk about are girls' rights and women's rights. I was astonished. Firstly, am I really that boring? Is that all I talk about? Okay. And then I was like, okay, I'm already in my 30s. Can I really pivot my career at this stage in my life? Surely it's just going to be too hard to make that sort of career transition. It was a few days later that I had that prophetic dream I told you about. When I woke up in the morning, I knew I had to follow its call. It was very clear. It's time to go back to Ireland, go to university and study gender in international affairs. So I followed it. Literally a few months later, I was in Dublin, starting my master's degree at Dublin City University. Almost immediately, I was designated as the class feminist. Now, this is sort of like late 2003, 2004. It was not cool to be a feminist back then. And I would be like, I'm so proud of being the class feminist, but why are they doing it like this when they talk about me? She's the class feminist. Don't really think that everybody else thinks it's very cool. Anyway, obviously I got over that and I moved on a couple of years later to work on my PhD. And my PhD and my master's degree, they both focused on a feminist analysis of peace and security and really examining gender and women and their inclusion in peace and security institutions. My PhD focused on the inclusion of women peacekeepers in peacekeeping missions. I was particularly interested in that topic because a few years earlier, the United Nations Security Council had adopted a resolution called 1325. That resolution clearly acknowledged the disproportionate effect of war and violent conflict on the lives of women and girls due to gender discrimination and inequalities. And it called on member states to do a number of things, and one of those was to increase the numbers of women they were sending to peacekeeping missions. You see, in many contexts, in many different fragile states and different cultural settings, women, due to religious and cultural norms, are forbidden from communicating directly with men from outside their tribe or clan. So having women peacekeepers there could make a real difference to women. They'd be able to engage with them and find out their specific security needs. That's what I wanted to find out more about. But at that time, in the Irish Defence Forces, there were very few women, and there were even fewer women who were being deployed specifically to engage with the local population. So I wasn't going to be able to continue my research as I had originally planned. I had to pivot, and I decided instead that I would look at the barriers to women peacekeepers being recruited and deployed to missions, because clearly this is something important that we need to understand. Now, my research wasn't specifically about sexual or gender-based violence, but a few of the women did share these particular experiences with me. They talked about being sexually harassed and assaulted within the Defence Forces itself. And they told me that they didn't want to report for fear of retaliation, and that it would just make their lives even harder. So I had an ethical dilemma. My study was a small qualitative study, and most of the women I interviewed were in one location. I was worried that if I kept their detailed narratives in my thesis, that some of these women could be identified, and that would put them at risk. So the question I was asking myself is, which do I do? What's most important? Sharing the women's stories or keeping the women safe? And this was a dilemma that I struggled with for very many weeks, until finally I decided that I would come up with a solution that would be sharing the fact of the matter, that these women had recounted these experiences to me, but without going into the detailed narratives, and calling on the Irish Defence Forces to look into these crimes and assaults that the women were reporting. So that's what I did. I put this into my thesis, and I had several meetings with various members of the Irish Defence Forces. None of them ever did respond to my request for further investigation. At the beginning of my research, I was just so aware what a privilege it is to be a PhD student. I was enthusiastic, exuberant, just full of the joy of my research, thoroughly enjoying it. But as time went on, I began to feel this overwhelming anxiety creep into me. And I was really confused. I couldn't really understand what was happening. And as the days went by, I began to feel this sense of self-hatred. And these voices, these really negative voices, start bubbling up to the surface of my consciousness. It got so bad that they were there every single day from the moment I woke up. And I really wasn't sure what was going on, but I knew I didn't like myself very much. And when I went to bed at night, I would lie awake because I just couldn't sleep because the voices were so loud. Eventually, I decided the only way I could end the pain was to commit suicide. And for weeks, I seriously contemplated it. I thought about the different ways I could do it. I knew things had gotten really bad, obviously, but I just really didn't know how to get out of this state of mind. Eventually, I went to see a counselor. My counselor told me that I had been a victim of sexual and gender-based violence in my younger life, that I had suppressed the memories. And in fact, it was the deep shame linked to this childhood trauma that was creating these hateful voices and these feelings of self-abandonment within me. So, while that was really helpful, it was still a really difficult situation to be in. And I wondered whether I could continue on this path as a feminist educator and activist, when I myself felt so powerless in the face of my own experiences of abuse. And that's when feminism saved me. And it really did. Because I learned that 1 in 3 women will be the victims of physical or sexual violence in their lifetime, and much of that at the hands of an intimate partner or family member. I learned that misogyny is woven invisibly through institutions and so normalized, we often don't even pay attention to it, whether it's the home, our schools, our governments, or our militaries. I learned that I hadn't done anything wrong, that I had nothing to be ashamed of, and that I was not alone. And it was this knowledge that gave me the will and the energy to keep going. Fast forward many, many years, and now all of my work is focused on gender equality and women's rights. And one of the things I had to overcome was this really deep fear I had of standing up to a powerful patriarchal institution. And during the course of my research, and like I said earlier, I didn't get the actual feedback that I wanted from my thesis and from my study. And so this is something that has always concerned me. In all of the courses I teach, I have an underpinning question I want my students to consider. And that is, how do we make the world a more secure and safe place for women, girls, and gender minorities, and all marginalized populations? The reason why I ask this question is because we have over 100 data sets that correlate women's rights with peace and security. In fact, the higher women's status is, both in the home and in the public sphere, the more likely that country is to be stable, secure, and prosperous. Put simply, the more gender equal a nation is, the less likely it is to use violence to resolve conflict. And if we think, for example, peace talks, if we look at peace negotiations, we know that when women are present in those negotiations and actively part of the negotiations, the peace is more likely to last for 15 years or more. When the average peace agreement, one where it's mainly men around the table, only lasts for 5 years. If you think about the Northern Ireland Good Friday peace agreement, it's lasted now for 25 years, and it was women who were instrumental in getting that peace across the line. So what can we do? Like, what is the problem? Like, how are we going to close the gender equality gap? Well, first of all, we need to be aware of the context in which we're all living. Only 20% of the global population is living in countries that are designated as free. When I'm talking about free, I'm talking about women having the right to choose what they want to wear, having the right to choose where they want to go and to travel freely, having the right to express their sexuality freely, and having the right to access reproductive health care. However, democracy has been in decline for the last number of years. And we know that autocratic regimes, one of the first things they do when they come to power is roll back women's rights. So what can we do? First of all, UN Women recently announced that they estimate it's going to take 300 years to close the gender equality gap. At the current pace of change, we need to speed things up. We need to ask, where are the women at the peace table, in governments, in militaries? And are we listening to them? Last month, an independent review group into sexual assault, harassment and bullying in the Irish Defence Forces released its independent report. I cried when I read it. 88% of women have said that they were sexually harassed. 48% said that they had unwanted physical touch or sexual assault. At last, the women in the Irish Defence Forces were being listened to. And so was I, because I was interviewed by the review group and I submitted a report drawing on my original findings. It was 10 years since my PhD was published, but at last I had my voice heard too. So what can we all do? And what do we need to do? It's clear that women's rights is critical if we want to end war and create peace. We need to keep working towards women's rights. 14 countries now, only 14, but still 14 countries have gender equality under the law. And I'm really pleased to tell you that one of them is Ireland. So it just tells you how quickly a country can change in just a few decades. And in fact, remember I was telling you earlier about me being the class feminist? Well, now we actually use the word feminist and foreign policy in the same sentence. And so there are actually 9 countries that have created feminist foreign policies or have stated that their intention to do so. Countries like Germany, France, Canada, Mexico. And what they're doing is they are centering women and girls and minority groups in the funding of programs. Now that's going to have a ripple effect on all of us. So, what can we all do? We need to ask, where are the women in our universities, in our classrooms, in our workplaces? Are we listening to them? How are we supporting them? Can we be an ally, a mentor, an advocate in some way? Let's think for a moment. Imagine a world where little girls are not left on the side of the road, nor sold. And imagine a world where each one of us is valued, safe, and secure. Like I said earlier, feminism saved me, and if we heed its advice, feminism could save us all. Thank you.